There was a man who lived 14 centuries ago in a stretch of Arabian desert that most of the ancient world barely noticed. By the time he died, he had reshaped the political map of the Middle East. Today, more than 1 billion people organize their daily prayers, their calendars, and often their whole moral framework around what he said and the things he did. But when historians actually sit down and try to nail down what happened in his life, event by event, they run into a wall almost immediately. This is not as a result of less available information, but because of the authenticity of all the available information. We have more material about Muhammad's life than we have about almost any other founder of a major religion. From detailed biographies to war records, marriage contracts, and sayings collected by the thousands. But nearly all of it was written 100 to 200 years after he died, by people living under empires that had a stake in how the story got told. A source written 2 centuries after an event is not automatically false, but it is also not automatically reliable. Historians have spent the last 100 years arguing about exactly where the truth sits in between. Some trust the tradition almost entirely, while others trust almost none of it. Most of the scholars treat every report like the way a detective treats a witness statement, useful but need to be checked. Tonight, I want to walk through 4 of the episodes from Muhammad's life that get the most argument. The goal is not to score points either way, but because they are genuinely interesting as historical puzzles. Each one has a traditional explanation inside the Islamic religion, and also a skeptical read from the outside. There are a lot of very smart people who have spent their careers disagreeing about which version holds up. Let us start with the sources themselves, because you can't evaluate any of the individual stories without understanding where they come from. The earliest surviving biography of Muhammad was written by a man named Ibn Ishaq, who died sometime around the year 767. That is over a century after Muhammad's death in 632, and even Ibn Ishaq's original text didn't survive on its own. What we actually have is a later editor's version, compiled by a man named Ibn Hisham roughly 70 years after that. Ibn Hisham openly admitted in his own preface that he had left things out, things that he considered improper to repeat or likely to upset people. That is not a neutral transmission, that is similar to tampering of evidence. Historian Fred Donner, who has spent decades at the University of Chicago studying this period, has been blunt about the problem. The accounts we rely on for the 7th century were shaped by people writing in the 8th and 9th century. Those people had their own political and theological stakes in how the founding story got told. That doesn't mean the record is fiction. It means every claim inside it needs to be weighed rather than simply accepted. This is exactly what historians on all sides of this debate try to do, even when they land in very different places. On one end, there are scholars like Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, who in the 1970s argued that Islamic sources were shaped by later agendas. They suggested that historians should reconstruct early Islam from non-Muslim chronicles written closer to the actual events. That approach produced a genuinely different picture of Islamic origins, and it was controversial even among historians who otherwise share their skepticism. On the other end, there are historians like Donner himself who believe in a more careful approach. Their view is that the traditional material, used carefully and cross-checked where possible, still gives us the best access to know what actually happened. Between those two poles sits most of the field, scholars checking each story against internal consistency and against what we know of the region. They also try to check if a detail seems like the kind of thing that someone could have invented later to make a point. With all this in mind, let's get into the specific stories, because this is where it gets interesting. The first one is sometimes called the Satanic Verses incident, though that name was actually coined later by a Western Orientalist, not by early Muslims themselves. Early in Muhammad's preaching in Mecca, while he was still a lone voice against a city full of polytheists, he is said to have recited verses that briefly acknowledged 3 goddesses worshipped by the Quraysh tribe. But he was said to immediately retract them and said the lines had been a whisper from Satan, not a revelation. If this is true, it would mean Muhammad briefly compromised the core of his monotheist message under social pressure, then walked it back. That is a big claim, and it is treated very differently depending on who you ask. Most later Muslim scholars firmly reject the story. It doesn't appear in the most rigorously authenticated hadith collections. The chains of transmission back to eyewitnesses are weak, and it conflicts with the doctrine that a prophet's revelation can't be corrupted by outside influence. But the story is not a modern invention either. Historian Shahab Ahmed, in a detailed 1999 study, traced references to it back to the earliest layer of Islamic historical writing, showing it was circulating among scholars within the first 150 years after Muhammad's death, which in this field counts as early. Some historians, including William Montgomery Watt, argued the story was too embarrassing for early biographers to have simply made up, and that an invented legend usually flatters its subject rather than compromising him. On the flip side, there are other scholars that push back on that reasoning. The historian Alford Welch pointed out that embarrassment alone doesn't prove something happened. Legends get embellished for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with flattery. The Satanic Verses incident is a story that was taken seriously enough by early Muslim historians to get recorded and debated. But it is also rejected firmly enough by later theological consensus that most practicing Muslims today have never heard of it at all. The second story is heavier, and it involves an actual military siege. In the year 627, Medina was under attack from a coalition of tribes allied with Muhammad's enemies in Mecca. During that siege, a Jewish tribe living in the city, the Banu Qurayza, was accused of communicating with the besieging army. This was seen as a potential betrayal of their agreement with Muhammad's community. After the siege ended and the Qurayza surrendered, an arbitrator was chosen to decide their fate. According to the dominant version in the early sources, that arbitrator ruled that the men of the tribe should be executed and the women and children taken as captives. That was a brutal outcome, and it is one of the most cited episodes when people want to raise hard questions about Muhammad's conduct in war. So what do historians actually say about it? First of all, there is real disagreement about the numbers. Some sources describe hundreds of people been killed. But some later scholars, using population estimates for a city the size of Medina, have questioned whether the numbers as reported are even physically plausible. Second, there is also a disagreement about the legal framing. The historian William Montgomery Watt treated the episode largely as reported. He situated it inside the harsh logic of tribal warfare in 7th century Arabia, where treaty violations during a siege carried severe consequences under the customs at the time. Other scholars, including some contemporary Muslim historians, have argued the arbitrator's ruling followed a specific pre-Islamic legal code. This was a code that the Qurayza themselves would have recognized as binding, rather than an arbitrary punishment invented on the spot. Thirdly, some scholars have questioned the history of the episode altogether. A few scholars point to inconsistencies across the various accounts. Others dispute over whether a formal treaty even existed between Muhammad and the Qurayza in the first place. These scholars suggested that there could be political motives among later narrators for the way the story got shaped. There is no certainty yet. This is an ongoing debate among historians, not a settled fact and not a settled fabrication. The third story is probably the one that people ask about most, and it concerns Muhammad's marriage to Aisha, the daughter of his close companion Abu Bakr. The most frequently cited hadith, appearing in the authoritative collection Sahih al-Bukhari, states that Aisha was 6 years old when the marriage contract was made, and 9 years old when the marriage was consummated. Under any modern legal or ethical framework, that would be considered child marriage, and it is understandably the detail that draws the most scrutiny. Traditional Islamic scholarship generally accepts this hadith as authentic, since it appears in Bukhari's collection, widely regarded as the most rigorously verified hadith source in Sunni Islam, and also because Aisha herself is the narrator. Scholars taking this position argue that marriage customs in 7th century Arabia simply worked differently than they do today. They also argue that betrothal and cohabitation were distinct stages, and that puberty was used as the marker of readiness. But other researchers, including some working from within Islamic scholarship itself, argue that the age don't add up against other historical details. Aisha is recorded as present near the battlefield at Uhud, a year after the marriage was reportedly consummated, carrying water to wounded soldiers. This is a role historians say seems inconsistent with a girl of 10. There is also a hadith placing her as old enough to remember a Quranic verse revealed several years before the Hijrah. This would push her likely birth year earlier than the standard account allows. Historian Joshua Little, in more recent academic work, has argued that the specific ages of 6 and 9 may have entered the tradition later than assumed. He said it could have been spread by a narrator working in Iraq, rather than tracing directly back to the earliest Medinan sources. If that argument holds, the actual age gap could have been meaningfully larger than the commonly cited figure. This remains an active and genuinely unresolved argument, not a case where one side has simply won. The fourth story is not one incident, it's a pattern, and it runs through the Quran itself. The verses revealed while Muhammad was still in Mecca, before he held any political or military power, are almost entirely about patience and peaceful persuasion. The tone shifts noticeably after he relocates to Medina and becomes the leader of an armed community facing constant threats from Meccan forces. The verses addressing warfare, treaties, and the treatment of enemies appear specifically in this later period. Scholars like Reuven Firestone describe it less as a single doctrine handed down all at once. It is something that evolved with Muhammad's changing circumstances, from a persecuted minority with no army to the head of a growing state. That does not settle the theological question of what these verses mean for practice today, but it does explain why the earliest and latest verses on the subject read so differently. Traditional Islamic jurisprudence developed its own careful framework around this evolution. They distinguish between verses understood as general guidance and verses tied to specific historical circumstances of conflict. Most critics sometimes flatten that complexity into a single storyline. But scholars always try to resist that flattening because the texts themselves resist it. When we put all of these into consideration, it leaves us somewhere unresolved. These are not cases where historians have quietly agreed on an answer and popular belief just hasn't caught up. They're genuinely open questions, argued over by people who have devoted entire careers to the sources. These people use methods that are rigorous, but built on evidence that is simply older and thinner than any of us would like. What strikes me more is how much they resemble the kind of historical puzzle you'd find anywhere else. Ancient sources, written after the fact, filtered through people with their own reasons for telling the story one way rather than another. That's not unique to Muhammad. It's the condition of almost all ancient history, whether you're reading about Alexander or Jesus or the founding of Rome. The distance in time does not hand us certainty. Instead, it hands us different versions. And the work of historians is to try and bridge the gap between them, instead of pretending that it is not there. That is not a satisfying place to end, and I'm not going to pretend it is, but it might be the more honest one. The historical Muhammad, like most figures from the past, comes to us through layers of memory, faith, and politics, all pressed together over centuries. Pulling those layers apart does not destroy the picture. It just makes it a picture with texture, contested edges, and real disagreement baked into it. And if you think about it, this is probably closer to what history actually is than the clean story that any of us would prefer.